I have not failed. I have just found 10,000 ways that won't work. I believe that you need to protect yourself from the constant flow of negativity that comes your way, and quotes are a great way to do that. Another way to protect yourself is to limit your TV time, but that's a topic for another day. We won't get into that on this episode. Welcome to episode number 4. And the title of this episode is Become a Mad Scientist. This idea of becoming a mad scientist in your personal life is an idea that I received from Tai Lopez. Tai is a businessman and social media expert that I follow online. He encourages you to constantly run experiments in your personal life. Here's an example of an experiment that I ran before. That experiment is the experiment of taking cold showers. If you do a search, a Google search or a YouTube search, you will find many benefits on taking cold showers. You'll find it reduces stress, improves mood, enhances skin quality. Kobe Bryant and LeBron James did cold showers after workouts to help their recovery. And so I thought I would experiment with cold showers. So after I finished taking my regular shower, I would turn the water to cold and just let it run on the back of my neck for as long as I could. And usually that was only a few seconds. It wasn't really that long. So I tried that for about 2 weeks. And at the end of those 2 weeks, the joints in my fingers started to ache as if I had arthritis. So I had to move on from that experiment. It didn't work for me. But I challenge you to check into that. And you might want to do that. Some of you might already be doing that, and it just might benefit you, but it didn't work for me. Another example of not necessarily an experiment I ran, but a discovery that I made. And that's related to books, physical books versus ebooks versus audiobooks. I have found that audiobooks work best for me, especially in terms of finishing the book. You know how it is. You get started with this book, that book, and you have so many unfinished books that you haven't read. But audiobooks, I typically always finish those every time I start one. And one of the good things about audiobooks is the fact that you can speed them up as you listen to them. You can listen to them at 1.25 times speed or 1.5 times speed, even 2 times speed. I found that 1.5 times speed works best for me. And you'll be surprised at just how normal an audiobook sounds at 1.5 times speed. So you're still being able to hear it and it sounds relatively normal to you, but you're getting done with the book faster. So that is something that has really worked for me. And you might want to experiment with what works best for you in terms of books. Now, let's look at this week's quote. This week's quote comes from Thomas Edison, and I gave that quote at the top of this episode. And the quote is, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." This is an excellent concept that you can apply to your personal life. That's why the title of today's episode is Become a Mad Scientist. If you can apply this type of attitude to your personal life, it would serve you very well. I tried to use this attitude in the process of launching this podcast. Whenever I would get to a difficult point or some type roadblock, I would just repeat to myself, "You're going to figure this out. You are going to figure this out. This is going to work." And that really helped me. So that is something, you might want to try to have that attitude in your personal life of becoming a mad scientist and constantly saying to yourself, hey, if one way doesn't work out, something is actually going to work out. Now, just a few words about Thomas Edison. Edison was born on February the 11th, 1847, and he passed away on October 18th, 1931. Most of us know Edison as the inventor of the light bulb, but the invention that actually made him famous in his day was his invention of the phonograph, the ability to record and play back sound. You can also thank Edison for the invention of the motion picture camera. Edison holds 1,093 U.S. patents in his name, according to his page on Wikipedia. My favorite story about Edison is a story that I first heard in Ryan Holiday's book, The Obstacle is the Way. Great book. I highly recommend that book. Terrific book. I can't say enough about that book. The story that Ryan Holiday tells about Thomas Edison happened when he was 67 years old, and a fire broke out at his research and production campus. 6-7 stories high were the flames, and it threatened everything that he had built, his entire empire. What was Edison's response? He said to his son, "Go get your mother and all her friends. They will never see a fire like this again." His son was amazed at his response, but Edison said, "Don't worry. We've only just gotten rid of a bunch of rubbish." Now, my friends, that is an attitude to have about the things that we have amassed in our lives. If Edison would have wept and gotten angry, the book makes the point, it wouldn't have accomplished anything. The point of the book was that to do great things, we must be able to endure tragedy and setbacks. Do yourself a favor and go get that book. Great book. Ryan Holiday, The Obstacle is the Way. Now, applying Edison's attitude about experimentation to our personal lives can yield some great benefits, as I mentioned earlier. I'll end with an example of how I'm applying experimentation to this podcast. Now, when I started the podcast, I mentioned in previous episodes that I hired a coach, a voice coach, to help me to do a better podcast. And he critiqued the introductory podcast and episode number 1. I think those were the only 2 he critiqued. And one of the questions he asked me when he was critiquing it, he said, "Well, how are you working? Are you using an outline? Are you writing it out? Just what are you doing?" And I mentioned that I was basically using an outline with bullet points. And he said, "Yeah, I could kind of tell you were doing that, because it seemed at some points his critique was that I was searching for a word here, searching for a word there." And so he was suggesting that perhaps I would write more of the podcast out. And that's what I did. And I experimented with that on the last episode number 3. And pretty much I had written out everything that I wanted to say. Now, here is the benefit of doing that. With it all being written out, it eliminates the searching for words. So it eliminates the uhs and the ahs, a lot of the pauses. But for me, what the experiment showed me is that I didn't really like that delivery where I'm reading most of what I'm going to say on the podcast. So I think I'm going to go back to just working from bullet points. To be honest with you, I don't mind some uhs here and there. I mean, it's normal in our normal speech. When we're talking to someone, we say Now, too many of those can be distracting, of course, and that was the point of my coach, because when he listens and critiques my podcast, he says one of the things he's doing, he's counting the uhs. My wife, she does Toastmasters, and that's a part of the process of Toastmasters. Every time you give a speech, someone is counting how many uhs you give. And one way to eliminate that is to have your speech written out. And that's one of the things that they do in Toastmasters. they write their speech out and memorize their speech and try to deliver their speech from memory. And when you're not searching for words, it eliminates the uhs. But I think I prefer my delivery, however, when I was working from strictly an outline and bullet points. So what I'm going to do is actually go back to using bullet points, and that's kind of what I did in this episode, but still have it nailed down in my mind exactly what it is that I want to say. And that could help with the delivery. So I'm going to be doing a lot of experimenting with this podcast and seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work, and keep, as I said in my introductory episode, let the podcast morph into whatever it morphs into. And I'm going to practice what I preach, what I'm talking about today, becoming a mad scientist in our personal lives. And I'm going to be a mad scientist with this podcast and continue to experiment and to see what works, what doesn't work. And what's so funny is when I told my wife about what my coach told me and the fact that I really didn't mind the uhs or, a few uhs here and there, my wife said, well, it doesn't really matter what you mind. It matters what your audience minds. And that was a pretty good point that she gave me, and I appreciate her for that. And ladies and gentlemen, I would once again like to thank you so much for listening to my podcast. And I would love it if you would hit the subscribe button and continue to come back again and again. And remember this, quotes don't work unless you do. Episode, let the podcast morph into whatever it morphs into. And I'm going to practice what I preach, what I'm talking about today, becoming a mad scientist in our personal lives. And I'm going to be a mad scientist with this podcast and continue to experiment and to see what works, what doesn't work. And what's so funny is when I told my wife about what my coach told me and the fact that I really didn't mind the uhs or, a few uhs here and there, my wife said, well, it doesn't really matter what you mind. It matters what your audience minds. And that was a pretty good point that she gave me, and I appreciate her for that. And ladies and gentlemen, I would once again like to thank you so much for listening to my podcast. And I would love it if you would hit the subscribe button and continue to come back again and again. And remember this, quotes don't work unless you do.